What's up, Arsenal? Hey, I'm Rob, and today we are finding refuge in righteousness. Romans 1:17 says, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." This book of Romans, it's a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Rome. And it's really the most extensive explanation of the gospel of Jesus that has ever been written. It's part of what we call the New Testament, this collection of writings that are all about this new covenant that God has established with man. We also have the Old Covenant in the Bible. We have an Old Covenant and a New Covenant, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The New Testament is all about Jesus. Jesus is the new covenant. The old covenant is a list of rules, laws that if people follow perfectly, they will be counted right with God. These covenants are agreements that says, here is our method by which man is made right with God. And in the old covenant, God gave a list of rules. He said, here are the perfect rules that man must follow in order to be right with God. And it was a pass-fail system. This is how you become righteous. This is how you become right with God. Either you do it perfectly or you don't. The problem with that is that it was an impossible list of rules. Nobody could do it. It was absolutely impossible. I mean, let's try a little test here. Let me throw some old covenant, Old Testament law rules on you. Have you ever eaten bacon? Fail. Have you ever showed up to a party empty-handed? Like you didn't bring the dip, you just showed up. Fail. According to Old Testament, Old Covenant law, that's a fail. Check the tag on your shirt, because if you got a 50-50 blend, fail. You cannot mix fabrics. All of these things are rules that you must follow to be perfectly righteous, perfect with God. Now, if you're familiar with the Mosaic law, which is what the Old Covenant is, if you're familiar with that, you know that there are kind of different kinds of laws and rules that God gave. And you might say, well, hey, those are like ceremonial or civil laws, but the important ones are the moral law, right? Like that tells us how to treat people. How do we love people? How do we love God? These are our 10 commandments, the moral law. Well, remember what the law, the covenant is. It is a method by which we are made right with God. So let's grab our 10 commandments, our moral law, and use that as a system to be right with God. Let's see how we're doing. Have you ever lied? Like ever? I know some of you, like me, grew up with the thing called LimeWire, and you stole, right? We steal. Have you ever stolen? We lie. We steal. These are things that we've done and we fail. Have you ever wanted something that somebody else had? Fail. So even with our simple 10 commandments, we could take any one of the 10 commandments and we fail. Paul wrote, if there was a law that could give life, God would have used it to give life. But there's not any law that we can follow to be made right with God. God gave this method for us to be made right with him, these rules to follow, but nobody could ever do it, which should lead us to ask a very reasonable question. Why would he do that? Why would God go, hey, here's a list of rules, do these, and you'll be right with me. We're good. But the laws are impossible. Why in the world would God do that? Why would he say, make a covenant that he knew we couldn't fulfill? It kind of doesn't make any sense, and it's a very, very reasonable question to ask. And if righteousness is a right standing with God, how in the world can we take refuge in righteousness? We should be asking this question. It's the perfect question. How do we take refuge in righteousness if there is nothing that we can do to make ourselves righteous? You see, it's when we actually dare to ask questions like this that we find beautiful answers. Today, we are going to find refuge in righteousness. We're going to find safety in a right standing with God. And to get there, what I'm going to do is we're going to go on a little trip. We're going to find some historical context of this law that God gave. To understand why would God give this law, we need to know the historical context. At what point in history was it giving? What events were surrounding this? Why would God do this? It's a great question. So if you jump 600 years before the law, we find a man named Abraham. God established a covenant with this man, Abraham, and it was a grace covenant. It was a promise from God to man. It was a gift, a free gift. And what God said is, Abraham, your descendants are going to live in a wonderful land. I am going to give it to them, and it's going to be called the promised land. This was the promise of God. This was the grace covenant. This was God saying, I have a gift for your descendants, the people of Israel, the Israelites. Fast forward to Moses, the descendants of Abraham were not in a land of promise, but they were in a land of slavery. The reality for them is that for 400 years, they lived in slavery in a culture with customs and religion that was not that of Abraham. It was the Egyptian way of life. This is how they grew up. This is what people lived in. Their reality was a different culture. Abraham, by then, we're talking hundreds of years later, Abraham was a distant memory, a legend. And that promise that God gave, that he was going to lead them into a land, it must have felt so distant. Abraham became a legend. The promise was distant. Maybe some of the people forgot about the promise altogether. But God did not. God is good on his promises. So God rose up He called Moses. He rose up Moses and he called Moses and he said, Moses, you're going to set my people free. And so Moses did. He led the people out of Egypt. And that's a whole story to itself. But Moses led the people out of Egypt. God was fulfilling the grace covenant. He said, we're going to the promised land. And they ran into a problem. That problem is that the Israelites did not know how to handle their freedom. They didn't know what to do being free. This is something these people had not experienced at that point. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle it. It was too scary. What do you do when you've been told your whole life everything you have to do and suddenly you're completely free? God said, we're going straight to the promised land, straight out of Egypt. Here we go, fulfilling the promise. And the Israelites said, wait. We need some rules. So they said to Moses, Moses, you go to God, ask him what we should do, and we will do it. That didn't go so well. They said, we need rules. See, for 400 years, they were told, when to go to sleep, when to wake up, what they could wear, when to go to work, everything. This is when you eat, this is what you eat. These are the materials that you must use in order to build our buildings. They were very controlled people. They lived in complete slavery. And they were set free. And they had no idea what to do with their freedom. You know, one of my favorite movies all time, Shawshank Redemption, an amazing movie. There's this scene in Shawshank Redemption where, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, too bad. There's a scene in there where Red, played by Morgan Freeman, he had spent his whole life in prison. From the time he was a young man, most of his life he spent in prison. And when he was an old man, he got out and he got a job at a grocery store. And there's a scene in there where he's working and he stops, he bags some groceries, the customer leaves, and he turns to his manager and he goes, "Restroom break, boss?" And the boss comes over and he's like, "Dude, you don't have to ask me for every little thing. Like, just go to the bathroom." And he explains he couldn't do it. He didn't understand. He was so conditioned to live in slavery, to live being told when he could go to the bathroom, when he could eat, when he could do everything. He couldn't do it. He didn't know how to live in freedom. And that's exactly what the Israelites were experiencing. They said, no, this freedom is too much. We don't know what to do. And man initiated this old covenant, this impossible list. And watch the goodness of God. While man had begged for a list of rules, God continued to freely provide. He gave free manna from heaven. He gave quail. Quail's like one of my favorite meals. I used to go to my nanny and papa's house, and we would go hunt some quail, and nanny would cook it up in the skillet. Quail, delicious. And God gave it freely. Here's your manna, here's your quail. God made water shoot out of a rock because they were thirsty. He gave them guidance. During the day, he said, here's a cloud. At night, there was a pillar of fire. And he said, all you have to do is trust me. That's it. And they said, no. This freedom is too scary. We need a list. We need the do's and don'ts. Tell us what to do and we will do it. And so God said, if you're going to choose law over love, if you're going to choose fear over faith, and if you're going to choose trying over trusting, here is the list of demands. This is what it looks like. You're not trusting the promise. God was leading them into the promise, and they said, no, this is too good. We need the list. Here they are, this impossible list of demands. This is what they desired. This is what they wanted. The freedom was too scary. And here's the thing. This problem that they had, we get kind of hard on these people, on the Israelites, but this is an old recurring problem that we see in the Bible. I mean, go way back to the very beginning. God put Adam and Eve in complete freedom with one rule: don't eat that tree. What was the tree? It was the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve said, we need the knowledge of good and evil. What they were saying is, we need the list. The Israelites were set free from Egypt, headed to the promised land, and they said, no, we need a list. The early church was set free. It is for freedom you've been set free. And they said, no, but we got to bring our list with us. And Paul said, do not submit to that yoke of slavery. The slavery. It's an old problem. Something we have to ask ourselves today is, are we doing the same thing? Are we living in the freedom that God has provided, or are we going, wait, God, where's my list? Here's the good news. To this old problem that has repeated itself throughout human history. Here's the good news, Romans 3:21. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. Apart from the law. In other words, it's not about this list of impossible demands anymore. Right standing with God is apart from the law. That's good news, right? Okay, so if it's apart from the law, how do we get it? And this is where the good news gets even better. The next verse, Romans 3:22 says, this righteousness, this right standing with God is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. Righteousness is given as a gift, as grace. Your right standing with God is an absolute gift, and you can't take credit for it. You can't earn it. It is given. We can take refuge in that. Take refuge in the gift of the safety of your right standing with God. Here's what that means. Let's get some application here. What that means is that on your worst day, in your darkest hour, you are good enough. Let me say that again. Let's go there. On your worst day, in your darkest hour, you are good enough. You meet the perfect standard because your righteousness has been given to you. You see, this law-based religion says you must do more, and then maybe God will tolerate you. See, God loves you, but he's pretty disappointed in your performance. And if you mess up too much, he might just turn his back on you. But see, the gift, the grace of this new covenant, this grace covenant says, not only are you enough, but you are perfect. Hear me. Not only does God love you, God likes you. You sit in the righteousness of God. You are right with God through faith in Jesus Christ. So on your best day, in your brightest hour, this also means you can't look down on others. If on your worst day you are good enough, then on your best day, you can't look down on others. Now, this sounds like kind of a restrictive, negative thing, but let me tell you, this right here is freedom. This is freedom. You are free from the religious game that says who is holy enough, who is righteous enough, who's anointed and who's not, who's good enough, who's performing at the right level. Because see, once we enter into that system, once we think we're performing better than somebody else, this system forces us. We either have to put on the mask or we have to lie and think we're being good enough. You can put on the mask or you can give up. Those are your two choices. Put on a mask or give up. You can fake it, or you can say, I can't do this. And honestly, the people who have given up and said, I can't do this, they're a lot closer to the truth than the people who believe they're performing at this perfect religious standard. Because you've received the righteousness of God, you now have full acceptance with your mask off. You are fully accepted with the mask off. What this means is you are free to love. You're living in freedom. You don't have to compare anymore. You don't have to perform anymore. You are free to just love. See, this is faith. When we put our trust in the work of Jesus, when we trust in what he has done, much like the forgiveness that Pastor Chad talked about last week. See, forgiveness isn't something that we receive little by little by little. We mess up and we get some more. We mess up and we get some more. No, you are a forgiven person. Much like that, righteousness is given. You've received it. It is a gift. You are in your right standing with God. Like forgiveness, it's not little by little, but this is who you are now. This is your identity. You are in right standing with God. You are 100% righteous as you will ever be, as righteous as you could ever be, as righteous as Jesus himself, because you have received the righteousness of God himself. As you grow in this grace, what you're learning to do is to grow in your outward expression of what God has done inwardly. That's what discipleship and sanctification and growth and maturity look like. That's what growth looks like, is you are simply outwardly expressing what God has done in you. Jesus didn't come to put an unbearable weight on your back. He didn't come to give you a law in order that you could follow it and become right with him. He's given you the gift of righteousness. He says, enter into my rest. Receive the gift. Some of us have sort of like, we kind of got one foot in the promised land and one foot in the desert, because that freedom is scary. Because I can't let go of my list. Man, for some of you, it's time to stop wandering in the desert. It's time to let go. It's time to start fully trusting in what Jesus has given you. Stop trying to become good enough. If you're trying to become good enough, you're still living in this old covenant that was never meant for you. Enter into this new covenant. Enter into this promised land. Enter into the gift. Receive the gift. And all it is trusting. It's trusting what Jesus has done for you. It's trusting what God has given you. It's time to take refuge in righteousness.
Man, isn't that good news? We hope that blessed you today. If it did, hit the share button and let somebody know that there is good news in this gospel of grace, that God loves us and that we are in the promised land with him. So thank you so much for worshiping with us. Thank you for being a part of this online experience. Don't forget, download the Arsenal app, go subscribe to our YouTube. If you need help, email us. And if you can continue to give, please continue to give. Support this ministry and what we're doing. Thank you guys. We miss you. We love you. Have an incredible week. Go love well. It's literally who you were made to be.